Good morning, good evening, good afternoon. We'll get started in a minute. So again, for folks to trickle in. So again, thank you all for joining.
Are we ready to get started?
Yeah, we have 5 minutes past. We can go ahead and get started.
Okay, perfect. Welcome, everyone. I'm Christine Madden, President of the International Youth Nuclear Congress, and I'm excited to welcome you to Climate Talks, a collaborative effort between the International Youth Nuclear Congress and the Clean Energy Ministerial's Nice Future Initiative. Climate Talks is an innovative webinar aimed at expanding the nuclear community's understanding of climate solutions beyond the traditional scope of nuclear science and technology, as well as offering opportunities to explore cross-cutting niche topics within our sector, like consent-based siting. By engaging with experts from diverse fields, we are hopeful that you will gain valuable insights that can lead to interdisciplinary collaboration and enhance our ability to communicate effectively within the climate community. So for those of you who are new to us, we're just going to take a few seconds to introduce you to IYNC and Nice Future. So IYNC is a global network of over 100,000 young professionals and students. We support their professional development and also the growth of young generation and nuclear societies globally. We currently exist in 48 countries, as well as the United Nations office in Vienna. We focus on communicating the peaceful uses of nuclear power and its applications, including as part of a clean energy transition, through establishing mechanisms to integrate young voices in decision-making processes, as well as create pathways for global and intergenerational networking and knowledge exchange. So we do this through 4 pillars: knowledge transfer and networking, climate action, professional development, and YGN support. And I'd invite you to visit our website and follow us on LinkedIn for more information about our activities. I'll now turn it over to my colleague, Yal, to introduce Nice Future.
Thank you, Christine. Hello, everyone. My name is Jal Desai. I work at the National Renewable Energy Lab. And Nice Future, which stands for Nuclear Innovation Clean Energy Future. It is an initiative of the Clean Energy Ministerial, and NREL is the operating agent of this initiative. This initiative is co-led by US, Canada, and Japan. Again, this initiative recognizes that there is no one-size-fits-all solutions to energy, and it fosters collaborations among clean energy supporters in exploring diverse solutions, including nuclear energy technology solutions, both electric and non-electric, for clean, integrated, and reliable systems of the future. And those are the 4 pillars on the right-hand side that you would see. And then lately, what we have been doing is we have started the Clean Energy RISE 3D journal for clean energy for community, and you would be able to see those 5 thematic areas. And we have listed our partners, our external partners, at the bottom of this slide. Next slide, please. And so Nice Future initiative, we have got 5 pillars. So the first one is in messaging communication, followed by advanced reactor technologies and nuclear renewable integrations. And then we have economic modeling and financing. And then the last 2 are non-electric applications and the technical development and mentorship. And I would ask you to visit our website to learn more about this initiative. Back to you, Christine.
And so we're excited today to have Shota Nayyar with us from Youngo, and she'll be discussing internal and external carbon pricing for just and clean for the just and clean energy transition. So Shota is a professional energy and climate policy consultant with over 5 years of experience creating growth strategies, sustainability strategies for cities and workplaces, application performance management, and carbon policy. She is adept in the field of economics, business strategy, global energy and climate policies, and carbon pricing for the real estate sector. Shota is also an active member of the renewable energy and leading the Ocean's Voice working groups within Youngo and Sustainable Policy Director at Young Women in Sustainable Development. She aids startups globally with a mission to tackle sustainable development goals, focusing on the just transition into a greener economy through building resilient communities. She's also an elected member of the Chartered Institution of Building Services Engineers, Sustainability Special Interest Group, contributing towards a low carbon transition for cities and communities. So we're really excited to have Shota here with us today, and I will turn it over to her to actively engage and lead us in a discussion around carbon pricing. Thank you, Shota.
Thank you so much, Christine. Very kind words and beautifully said. Let me share my screen. Just let me know when you can see it. Sharing it right now. Can everyone see that? Also, I cannot see your faces because I'm sharing my screen. So if you have any questions, feel free to shout out. So I'll get started. First of all, thank you so much, Christine and Jel, for the introduction. And I think this is a great opportunity for everybody to understand a little bit about carbon pricing. And essentially what I'll be trying to do here is correlate it to different segments of the renewable or low carbon energies. I've taken nuclear as one of our case studies, and I think this would be a nice way to understand how internal or external carbon pricing, or when you are internalizing those externalities, how will carbon pricing eventually be a driving force for having competitive prices within the nuclear industry particularly. uh, so at any point, if you think I'm talking across and you cannot see my screen move or my slide move, please feel free to pop it in the chat and Christine or somebody will shout out and let me know. All right, let's get started. So, uh, just a short introduction again. My name is Shraddha, and I'm an net zero professional here to present today a session on carbon pricing. But before I dive into today's topic, I just would like to know how many of you know about carbon pricing. You can react to thumbs up if you know a little bit or you know what the concept is but don't know much in detail, and you can react to heart if you have a lot of experience, know what it is, and you've already been working on it. So based on that, I can tweak my content a little perhaps. Yeah. Okay. I see something. Well, let me get going then. Um, so essentially, what we're trying to do here is what I'll do through my agenda is that I want you to think of this as a form of a storyline that goes from understanding a little bit about just and clean energy transition, what it is, and then jumping on to understanding what are the different types of carbon pricing, internal, external, then understand a little bit about the carbon markets, because that is eventually or where the carbon pricing will have its impact on. So understand a little bit about the evolution of carbon markets, and then understand, okay, so now we know about energy transition, now we know about carbon pricing, how does the carbon market work. Then we will move on to using carbon pricing as a policy mechanism or a tool for clean energy transition. Then we would understand a little bit about the challenges in implementing carbon pricing, because if if it was such at a such higher commercial rate, we would see it across all of the countries in the world, but we are not. So we will understand what are the challenges of implementing such big macroeconomic policy. And then we would dive into the future of carbon pricing, which would be a short segment on, what does the horizon look forward to for carbon pricing. And then we will touch upon a short case study by Nuclear Energy Agency. And then there's a final segment at the end called the golden thread, where I'm using carbon pricing as the golden thread that connects all of these different segments of the market together and understand this. If you have any questions throughout, please feel free to pop them in the chat. Or if you have any immediate questions, you are always welcome to reach out to Christine or somebody else, and they'll probably unmute themselves and give me a hint of the question. Super. So let's get started. Just and clean energy transition. Pretty sure some of you must have already, you must be knowing what is just and clean energy transition. But just for those who don't know or are new to the concept, what I'm going to do is um, explain what just transition is. So basically, the code that you see there is something that popped into my head a few days ago when I was making this presentation. So just transition was, the history of it is it was essentially started by the labor market parties in the US, where when people started moving away from fossil fuel powered power plants to green energy. So the hardest hit communities at that time were the workers or the laborers. So that is how the concept of just and transition came into picture. So it says climate change demands a change in the way people run this planet, and people demand that the change not be biased. So essentially that is what just transition is about. And how we are relating that to clean energy transition is that the main three concept of clean energy is energy security, energy equity, and environmental sustainability. So the energy that we are receiving in our homes, that should essentially be secure so that the light in my house is always powered, and I'm not going through like days of blackout, because that eventually has a huge impact on the social activities. And the second one would be energy equity. Irrespective of my financial background, or if I'm coming from a low income country or a high income country, I should be able to afford it. That's where equity comes into picture, that everybody is able to pay what they are able to afford. um, and then last is environmental sustainability, and this is, I think, very much key, because when we talk about just and clean energy transition, when we talk about carbon pricing or renewable or low carbon energy, the basic concept is that you are causing less damage to the environment. You are able to protect the environment, conserve it, and cause minimal impact. So these three are the part of energy trilemma, which the World Energy Council speaks of. And to be able to touch upon this world, these three energy trilemma key points, what is important is that you also bring in just transition when you're choosing a different form of renewable or clean source of energy. So that is a small point on just and clean energy transition. Now, here comes the next segment, which is carbon pricing. And when you talk about carbon pricing, it is essentially putting a dollar sign on 1 ton of carbon, to speak in very simple words, that is carbon pricing. And explicitly, when it was initially started off in 1997 Kyoto Protocol, it was required that going forward, everybody should try to reduce their carbon emissions. Based off of that basic concept, when carbon pricing was introduced into the market, explicitly they were divided into two segments: emissions trading scheme and carbon taxes. Emissions trading scheme, or ETS, is basically a cap and trade system where you have uh, cap on how much emissions you can emit. And if you, let's say I can emit 100 tons of CO2, if I'm doing 120, I will have to buy a carbon credit for the extra 20 tons of emissions I'm doing. If I do 80, then I have the leverage to sell carbon credits based on the 20 tons of CO2 that I did not emit. So it's more like a very trading scheme. If you're familiar with the financial trading scheme, this is somewhat similar but for carbon. And carbon taxing is just a flat tax, the stuff you pay for on your income in whichever country you're coming from, um, um, and or the stuff that you pay on food, service tax, things like that. So carbon tax is like a flat tax amount that you pay if you are the one who's an emitter. So then after emissions trading scheme and carbon tax, that's where it began, when and then the carbon market obviously evolved, which we will touch upon in the next segment. um, there are other forms of carbon that came into picture. What was internal carbon pricing, carbon offsetting, and result based climate finance. So I'll not go detail into much of what these are essentially. But when you talk about internal and external carbon pricing, external is basically any type of a policy mechanism for carbon pricing which is initiated from the market or by the market. It could be international carbon crediting mechanism, or it could be a national or a government or a federal mechanism. It could be even by any individual um, standard um, standalone crediting mechanism, like BCS or gold standard. um, Even result-based climate finance is something that is initiated externally. Internal carbon pricing is usually done by organizations who want to price of uh, put a price on the carbon emissions that they do through their operations. So essentially, what they're doing is internalizing the externalities, because they know that at some point their operations are going to be affected by the carbon tax or the emissions trading scheme or any other form of carbon pricing mechanism that the government or any external factor is going to impact. So what they do is, before starting a project or a huge program or anything, they try to put a price on carbon emissions from that particular project, let's say. And that is how internal carbon pricing comes into picture, when you're trying to internalize the external impact. So that's the generic idea on what's carbon pricing and what are the different types of carbon pricing, what is internal and what is external, and who's getting impacted by whom. So just moving forward. Okay. Evolution of carbon markets. So basically, evolution of carbon markets is that it's a little important. I'm not going deep into this because I don't want you to get lost in it. You can absolutely spend an entire lifetime and career just studying about carbon markets. But it is a little bit important to understand the evolution of carbon markets, because it's going to come back later in the end when we talk about low carbon energy and how carbon pricing is impacting them. So if you look at the graph on the chart on the right hand side, sorry if it's too small, but I think I can read it. These are different segments or sectors, like for example, power, mining, aviation, shipping, buildings, transport, agriculture, waste. Each of these sectors have emissions that come through to them, and the small squares are essentially the different types of policy mechanisms that have been implemented at any level. It could be local, national, private, or international level, for that particular sector. And if you look at this, it says 75 countries actually have carbon taxes and emissions trading scheme in operation worldwide. And most of these are basically from the power industry. And now you know why I had to bring this up, because we talked about just energy transition, just clean energy transition. And for that to come into effect and to be able to relate to the carbon pricing on the carbon market, you need to understand that carbon markets, where it started from, they started off from the power industry, but they have eventually evolved into all of the different sectors. But more than half of the emissions trading scheme and the carbon tax schemes uh, across the world cover the power sector, because basically what we're trying to do eventually is to move away from fossil fuels and move towards low carbon or clean energy renewable sources of energy. So this is little critical to understand the evolution of carbon markets and where exactly the different mechanisms of carbon pricing. So the different types of carbon pricing that we discussed in the previous slide, how are they being implemented and in which industry and where? Awesome. Now, moving forward. So this is another just a small graph showing what is the cost of carbon or dollars per tons of CO2 for emissions trading scheme and carbon pricing. So direct carbon prices, like you see in the graph on your right hand side, have increased over the last decade, but in the past few years, it has seen a little bit of mixed development. So when federal governments try to implement a carbon pricing mechanism, most of them essentially go for a carbon tax because it's a flat tax, and anybody who's a carbon intensive emitter, they have to essentially pay that price. So it's that's how that when you talk about evolution of carbon markets, it's important to understand that carbon taxing was started initially, and the cost of carbon, if you look at this, has been from 2017 up until today. The cost of carbon has just increased. So this is why this is important to understand is this cost of carbon is external that we're talking about. And if you understand this trend of increasing carbon cost, you will, uh, when you talk about internal carbon pricing, most of the companies will want to at some point avoid this carbon tax or the price they have to pay for the cost of carbon through emissions trading scheme, whichever part of the world they are in. Um, so to do that, what they'll do is they'll put an internal price of carbon within their operations internally. And what that does is you will use that amount of money to invest in something that is low carbon. If I'm a wind turbine manufacturer, I would in turn put an internal cost of carbon that, I will get my steel that is green steel, or yeah, like a green steel or low carbon cement or concrete. And then in that case, because my embodied carbon emissions are less, I will have to not end up paying a lot of taxes externally. So I'm redirecting my own money to something that is more renewable or clean or has less carbon emissions. So it's important to understand this trend of external carbon pricing. So sometimes that helps decision makers or within businesses to understand, okay, so if I continue going, this is going to impact my operations at some point, and I'll end up giving more money to the government, let's say, if I don't internalize those externalities. Moving forward, carbon pricing as a policy mechanism and a tool for just energy transition. Now you have understood just and what does just transition mean, why what does clean energy transition means, how does the carbon markets work, what is carbon pricing, what are the different types of carbon pricing, internal, external, all different kinds of carbon pricing. Now, when carbon pricing essentially is a macroeconomic policy, and what this does is, let's say if there is a carbon tax, flat tax over the entire country, whichever country, pick any country you want, people who will be for let's say for transport sector. So if you have a petrol or diesel based car, you have to, for the amount of emissions you do per year, you have to pay x amount of x dollars for per tons of CO2 that comes from your car. Now people who are in the upper segment of the society will be able to afford it to a certain extent. They will also be able to switch their cars to, let's say, electric cars because they are able to afford that. So they would be like, okay, I would rather change my car to an EV than give the government the tax. But some the low income segments of the society, they are the ones who are being hit eventually, and there that is where which we'll cover in the next slide. Basically, are the challenge that we see. When you come to how can we use carbon pricing in a way so that it is just. So you see the two. bar colors there. So the green ones, so international crediting mechanisms, government mechanisms, independent crediting mechanisms, like I mentioned, these three are, let's say, the supply side of the market. When you talk about economics, there is a supply side, there is a demand side. So if I am a shampoo manufacturing company, those who are new to economics, just very quickly, if I'm a shampoo manufacturing company, so there is the supply side would be, there is lots of different new, let's say, colors of or fragrances of shampoos that I'm releasing. But if the customers don't really want that, they just want like a normal shampoo, then um, that means the demand side, which is the consumers, they don't really want it. So then there is an imbalance between the supply and the demand. But let's say there is high demand and I'm not able to produce it, that means the demand side is high and supply is low. So, it's very, very similar when you talk about driving the price of carbon when there is supply and demand side. So the green ones are essentially the supply side market, where there is an international mechanism or there is a national mechanism. For example, there's a Californian crediting system market. So that essentially what it does is it taxes people to transition into EV. So whatever mechanisms are adopted by the government at local, national, regional, or international level, those would essentially be the supply side of the market. And the red ones that you see are kind of like the demand side markets driving that price. Here, I will just touch upon the result based finances. This is kind of essential to talk about. Or key to talk about when it comes to clean energy or clean technology, because result based finances, how it works is that the climate finance mechanism is incentivized based on what is the result of a particular project. So if I'm going to climate fund organization and I'm like, I have a great technology, once that technology is produced or manufactured or it comes into effect, I will be able to reduce 500 tons of carbon. So once they see that I have reduced what I promised, then I would get funds to commercialize it or uh, project it onto a larger market. So this is important because this mechanism, if you pair this mechanism with, let's say, the international crediting mechanism, what will happen is that this will create demand. So there are more people trying to come and say, "Oh, I also have a technology which will reduce carbon." And when that happens, you have funds that are being dispersed off into these projects or programs. But then, when the government sees that, or the federal, state, or wherever, whoever sees that there is a demand for this, they would also put in a policy which will give people an opportunity to buy these carbon credits before the project starts. So you see, there is a small thread that follows through, and this is very critical for clean energy because let's say if you have an offshore wind farm or a low carbon energy source like nuclear, what happens is initial capex costs are really high. So if if the investors are applying for a result based finance, they're able to show that that type of energy is not just able to produce energy for an entire village or a town or a city or even a country, but they are also able to reduce carbon emissions. So they would be able to apply for these mechanisms that from a demand perspective, from a demand market side market perspective, and then seeing that the governments will be able to tweak or shift their policies or drive the cost of carbon from their end, seeing this demand of people wanting more clean energy. So that is policies that this has kind of confused people. But when you talk about carbon pricing, it's a little bit important to understand who's driving the prices of this carbon, because people usually ask, so who's deciding how much it should cost? So there are lots of factors that go into it depending on where is the demand coming from. Um, this brings us to our segment of what are the challenges we have seen so far in implementing carbon price. And um, there are a lot more other smaller challenges that you will see if you go on to read more about carbon pricing. But I have picked and chosen four of them, which people are talking about a lot, and they want to have further clauses within their policy mechanisms that can mitigate these challenges. So the first one, I think we already discussed about it, disproportionately impacting the low income segment of the communities on supply side. So if I have a carbon taxing mechanism in my country, let's say, it is going to impact the low income segment of the society. And that is one of the biggest challenges that we have seen with carbon pricing, because I think Jal mentioned it in the introduction. You cannot have a one size fits all. You cannot put a blanket price and say everybody has to pay $50 per tons of carbon. There are people who have $50 per day of income, so they just cannot afford it. So, and the second point is carbon leakage. So it's, the concept is very simple. Just when you think about leakage, it's exactly like it sounds, but it's not like carbon is actually leaking out. Carbon leakage is essentially, if I'm a company, if I'm based in, let's say, Netherlands, and the carbon price in Netherlands is, let's say, $74 per tons of carbon, for me to manufacture something that is very carbon intensive in that country. So what I'll do is I'll move to a cheaper country where the carbon price is cheaper, and then I will manufacture my products there, and then I'll import it to Netherlands. So this is just an example. I'm not specifically calling out Netherlands or any other country. Um, so what happens in that is, if everybody starts to go to countries where the price of carbon is less, and then starting to import that, that carbon difference is, the amount of carbon does not change from the manufacturing, but the price of on that carbon that people are paying, or the manufacturers are paying on it, will become less. It's a profitability point of view for the manufacturer, but from a carbon perspective, it's not great for our environment either way. So that difference of carbon price is called carbon leakage. That is also one of the challenges people have seen so far. And there, what Europe right now is doing is that the European Union is, they have a system called CBAM. It's Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, and basically it tells people that if you are bringing your from your supply chain, if I'm a wind turbine manufacturing company, and I'm bringing my wind turbines being manufactured in some low carbon cost uh, country, and if I'm importing it, I would also have to pay a price on that import. It's kind of like an import and export tax, but this just encourages people to look for sources locally. So that also reduces carbon leakage. The third implementation challenge we have seen so far is unregulated voluntary carbon markets are often not transparent and hard to maintain integrity. So when you talk about carbon markets, you have moderated carbon markets, and you have voluntary carbon markets. Voluntary carbon markets are basically, if I'm a company and I feel very enthusiastic about, saving the environment, or be having incorporating sustainability into my operations, what I'll do is I will say, okay, you know what, I'm ready to buy some carbon credits for the amount of emissions I'm making, or I'm ready to sell some carbon credits because I managed to save and not and avoid some amount of carbon emissions. So because it's voluntary, people can choose to do it, choose not to do it, and if they choose to do it, there is lack of transparency in what they're doing, and also to maintain the integrity of voluntary carbon markets, it's kind of difficult. But address this to address this, there is a system called the Voluntary Carbon Markets Initiative. This is basically to understand and maintain the integrity of that particular carbon market. Um, Finally, the fourth challenge we have seen so far is unsupporting complementary policies, like energy policies and inconsistent GHG measurements. So GHG is greenhouse gas emissions. If you do not have, basically, you're paying a price on carbon for the amount of carbon emissions that you have emitted. But if you are not able to measure the exact amount, what happens is there is inconsistency and inaccuracy in what you're measuring and what you're paying for it. Um, Along with this is particularly for there are the policies or the energy policies for a particular country may or may not necessarily be supportive or complement the carbon policies of that country. And this is usually impacting the renewable technologies or low carbon technologies like wind and solar and nuclear or hydroelectric or geothermal, and even tidal. We'll come to that bit in the next segment. But yeah, so it's important to have complementary policies of from the government's end, and when that if you have complementary policies, implementation of a carbon price would be much easier. Great. Now, the future of carbon pricing. So basically, like I said, it's important, the relation between internal and external carbon pricing, and how internal carbon pricing is basically is useful for investors to internalize their externalities, especially when you're investing in a very high capex technology like nuclear or tidal. So the first point basically is national budget deficits can be seen this as a new source of revenue. So as you must have, if you're following the economic market of the world, you would know that there are lots of countries facing national budget deficits, and this has been going on post pandemic. Came up in early 2023, fell down again. A lot of geopolitical issues. Everything has caused, and even for the next few years, national budgets will always be tight. So when there is a budget constraint, if you look at it from a home perspective, when you are having budget constraints, and if you take up a new job, that's a new source of revenue. Which brings us to our second point, that if carbon pricing can be seen as a policy mechanism for energy transition, you can also see this as um, it'll increase climate funds and for clean energy or clean technology, and this can be considered as a new source of revenue for a lot of nations. So that would be a positive and a bright future for carbon pricing. Then you would have the third point is the conventional schemes of taxing. So you can also think of carbon pricing as, it's just going to be a tax that the policies may or may not evolve in a way that it will just become like a conventional scheme of having a flat tax. Then you would and then the last 2 points are basically decentralized schemes. So you can have individual private sector firms developing their own carbon pricing credits, and that would be a voluntary market scheme. Or the last point is that the future of carbon pricing just does not it stays stagnant for a long time, because there is political polarization in the world or in a particular country. So that just happens. But if you look at the trend in that graph on the right hand side, that is the global revenue trend that's coming from carbon pricing since 2017 to 2023. So there's a lot of revenue that's coming up. So this can be seen as a positive way of taking when it comes to generating new revenue. But again, um, we just need to have complementary policy schemes along with carbon pricing schemes, so that it does not negatively impact the low income segment of the country. Which brings us towards the end of the presentation a little bit. Just doing a little bit of time check. Christine, are we good for time?
Yeah, you have a few more minutes. We have a few questions, but I think it's good to kind of internalize how it applies to nuclear energy.
Okay, awesome. So given we have a few more minutes, what I'll quickly do is, this is almost the end. This is basically the case study that I was talking about, the Nuclear Energy Agency. Everybody knows about the Fukushima nuclear plant attack. Sorry, Fukushima nuclear plant disaster that happened in 2011 due to a natural disaster. So at that time, the Nuclear Energy Agency was performing some form of carbon pricing analysis, how this is going to impact the nuclear industry. But post the mishap, or post the disaster, um, they did another analysis to understand, is this going to change the way people view nuclear energy? And I've got two slides here. This slide is basically picking up on the analysis that they did a few years um, after Fukushima, so around 2011-12. And why this is important is because in the next slide it shows the current trends. So this case study is crucial to understand that their predictions about how the carbon cost is going to change the way the competitiveness of nuclear industry changes in terms of cost of electricity, or the number of investors investing in nuclear energy. Because of this, how basically the carbon pricing will drive the way people look at nuclear energy. And given, when in comparison to a lot of other renewable energy technologies, nuclear is low carbon, and not trying to start a ride here, but nuclear is low carbon, and um, above all, nuclear is able to provide that sense of energy security that we talked about. So in the first slide, we discussed about energy security, energy equity, and energy affordability. So, to bring together the just clean energy transition concept. So because of that high peak load, or load factor for nuclear energy, it has still been in the running, irrespective of what people have concerns regarding safety and stuff. But keeping that aside, how the carbon price changes is that the cost competitiveness with coal power plants, if a significant amount of carbon tax is imposed, it changes, because right now its main competitor is coal power plant in terms of efficiency and how much it can produce. But if you have a carbon tax or a carbon price that is being imposed on carbon intensive form of energy source, then the prices for nuclear, when you compare with a carbon with coal or gas, would be very, very competitive, which means more investors will be essentially interested in that. And I've listed down some 7 key factors here that will affect the profitability of nuclear power, because it's not just about having a carbon tax on coal power or fossil fuel based power plants. Capex costs are definitely high for nuclear. So is for a lot of other forms of um, fossil fuel based energy sources. The financing costs, the gas prices, the price, basically the price of electricity and gas prices, and the profit margins are 3 key factors that will drive the way people will look at, especially investors will look at nuclear energy um, as a low carbon source of energy. In addition to this, when you have carbon prices, if you look at the chart on the left, for coal, gas, and nuclear, the average profits, um, when you actually have the European Union emissions trading scheme or the carbon tax implemented, when you look at that gr- um, element of it, nuclear definitely is has a high run. You know, so the so this was an analysis that the Nuclear Energy Agency did. And when you move forward and look at the levelized cost of electricity for nuclear energy, this graph shows that nuclear is pretty high um, when you're comparing it to coal or solar or even onshore wind. And that is because carbon pricing has an impact on the levelized cost of electricity. So basically, how much is the electricity going to cost based on how much capex investments are being done. So this carbon pricing has an impact on LCOE, and like I mentioned before, if there's a carbon tax or carbon pricing scheme that's implemented for those of a fossil fuel based power plant, that means it would essentially have an impact on how you look at the cost of electricity that's coming from nuclear. That would become competitive. Um, this is the end of the presentation, where I basically tell you that the golden thread of carbon pricing and you see that yellow dots or lines. That was the best thread I could find. But basically, the golden thread of carbon pricing is kind of bringing together these four key segments that I have identified through my work and research and everything, and I believe is actually very like a reflection of the carbon market when it comes to low carbon source of energy. So one is investment in low carbon or renewable energy. If you have more revenue coming in through carbon pricing, there'll be more funds that are going towards investment in low carbon or renewable forms of energy. Another one would be the LCOE of that's the levelized cost of electricity of low carbon or renewable technology. Just like in the previous slide, we saw carbon pricing can drive the way the low levelized cost of electricity changes for each type of uh, renewable or conventional form of energy. The third one is energy security. When you have technologies like nuclear energy, tidal, which where even though capex costs are really high, there's a form of energy security that it brings along due to its high load factor, and that energy security is very very important for everybody in a particular nation to be able to have their lights on throughout the year. And the last one would be reduction in carbon emissions. All this is basically towards a common goal that you have to reduce the carbon emissions in the environment. Um, so you can see how the carbon pricing has a huge impact in the way all these four segments are being, how all these four segments drives the carbon price, but how carbon price also drives the way these four segments are moving, and all of this together is essentially when you talk about just energy transition. So yeah, that is the end of my presentation. Hope there was a little bit of understanding among people. Open for questions now.
Shota, thank you so much. I don't know much about carbon pricing, so I really enjoyed your presentation, and you there was something that you said in terms of like where's the demand coming from, and I was thinking about the societal impact and the social cost that we saw maybe starting about 10 years ago with climate change, where a lot of companies were unwilling to integrate um, friendly climate practices and sustainability practices into their business models because it was too expensive and it made them less competitive. But then the social costs, I think largely driven by young people, and women created and incentivized them to voluntarily improve their practices and make sustainability kind of a pillar in their business model. And so I was wondering, kind of looking at this case study, have you seen any similar considerations in the climate pricing market in terms of how social costs are driving change for the positive as we look towards a just transition?
Absolutely, yes. That's a very good question. Thank you so much, Christine. Absolutely, yes, because what we're seeing as basically is that when you're doing purely from an economics and finance perspective, when you're talking about a particular project that's ongoing that I'm going to start from my company, let's say, in the I can't say olden times, but a few years ago, like 10 years ago, people only considered about from a when you do a cost benefit analysis of a project, where people are going to see how much money am I going to put it in, and what's the benefit, how much am I going what's my return on investment on putting so much money. And we all do that in our day-to-day life when we go to buy groceries. We think, oh, do I really need to do this? Do I need to buy that? So what companies have eventually started doing is they add in a factor for ESG, environmental, social, and governance. And they started putting a price against the environmental impacts, and they put it under the cost and benefit, both segments of their economic analysis for a project. So what they've started doing is, for any big programs where there is a huge social impact or a huge environmental impact, they started putting a price. That's where the price of carbon actually comes into picture, because they're like, okay, I'm going to manufacture steel here. This is my new company. So how much emissions am I going to? Nobody considered emissions before, but now they're doing. So they're putting a price of how much it is going to impact the carbon, how much it's going to impact the environment and the social aspect as well. Am I Are people losing jobs because of my project, or are people getting jobs because of my project? So they started adding that cost into their economic analysis on a day-to-day basis. So yes, absolutely, we are seeing that change trickle through different companies as we go along.
Thank you so much. I'm really happy to hear that. So another question that we have in the chat from Alice is, what are your expectations for the key outcomes of COP29 in terms of advancing global carbon market?
Um, it's too soon to say, but I just took a look at the COP29 agenda, Alice, and I think because this year's theme is climate finance, I'm going to say that climate finance has, like I explained before, that climate finance has a huge impact on the carbon markets, and because it's a new form of revenue for all the nations, it's a new form of revenue for international organizations and trade bodies. So people are going to take a look at carbon pricing and the carbon market to see whether or not they can get more funds through that kind of policy mechanisms, in when you talk about climate finance. So yes, definitely.
Thank you. Another question coming from Justin. What will it require for a farmers cooperative like Union Farmers of Africa to engage in carbon credit farming plantation?
This is a little bit more tricky to answer because, when you talk about farmers cooperative unions, carbon crediting mechanism is not entirely beneficial for the farming industry, but um, there is something called, a part of carbon crediting mechanism is the nature-based solutions, which is being very common nowadays, with a lot of companies wanting to invest in that. So when you talk about the impact, so the question is, what will it require for farmers cooperative to engage in carbon crediting farming plantation? So first things first, you need to understand the carbon market and how the crediting mechanism works. When you're I think this is specific to the African Union, so you need to understand first of all which African country you're going towards, and what is the international crediting mechanism or the national crediting mechanism in that country. You need to see whether or not that is supporting or complementing the farmers, or the farming industry in general. And then you can have, if you are an independent, it was there in one of my slides, it was, if you are an independent marketing credit mechanism organization, then you need to see that whether your policies are complementing what the national policies are for carbon credits. And if the farmers really want to be involved in that, they need to look at it from a carbon reduction, nature-based solution side of things, because the emissions from farming are comparatively much less when you compare to emissions from other sectors. But there is also benefit that you're giving. There's a social benefit and environmental benefit when you're talking about farming. So you also have to put a price on those environmental and social benefits. So then you can actually be able to pay less for the carbon you are emitting and have a credit mechanism that maintains that balance.
Thank you. And the last question, what role do you see for voluntary carbon markets in complementing regulatory carbon pricing schemes?
Sorry, I'm just going to read that again. What role do you see for voluntary carbon markets? Oh, in complementing regulatory carbon pricing schemes. Um, well, that is one of the biggest challenge that I mentioned, Alice, in the challenges that I said. The issue with voluntary carbon markets is lack of transparency. So, and you cannot have a policy like one price blanket deal for voluntary carbon markets, because it's voluntary. People can do it or not do it. So this is important though when you're talking about regulatory carbon pricing schemes, because regulatory schemes are more like, oh, you have to pay that tax, you have to pay the carbon price. But that may also backfire if you didn't have the voluntary carbon market scheme, because they see demand, like I talked about the demand and supply side of things, right? So voluntary carbon markets can also be considered as the demand side of things. If I am voluntarily ready to pay for the carbon emissions that I am emitting, then that would also drive demand from my end. And the regulatory committee for the national carbon pricing scheme will be like, oh, okay, so people genuinely want to pay a tax. So then they will try to change their policies in a way that will complement the voluntary carbon market. So even though there's a challenge for lack of transparency in that, it kind of drives the demand from the VCM side to the regulatory carbon pricing scheme. Hope that helps.
Thank you so much, Shota, for sharing your expertise with us today. I know I learned a lot, and we already have requests for your for sharing your presentation slides. I'd also like to thank our audience for joining us today, and we encourage you to follow both IYNC and Nice Future on LinkedIn, as we'll be posting future events. We have another event next week. And so we hope to see you there. And y'all, do you have any other closing remarks?
Yeah. No, again, thank you, Shraddha. It was very informative, and thank you all for joining. And as Christine mentioned, we'll have this ongoing climate talks on a bi-weekly basis, and the next one is scheduled for next week. Perfect. Thank you all for joining.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, all.